Hey everybody, good morning. Shai here and Colin.
Yeah, hi guys.
We're going to be walking through the Repetier firmware today. Hopefully, giving you guys some more information on the config.h file, how to go through the actual web UI, how to set up your firmware. Right, and we're going to try to cover as many details as we can through the UI. A lot of these are generic settings that can apply to any printer. We'll touch on any things that are specific to the ENIAC. We're going to cover mostly the UI first because that's the easiest way. And we are going to provide you guys with a config.h file so it's easy to upload. You can get started quicker, but we do encourage you to maybe have them settings side by side and go through the UI on your own and manually pick and choose those settings. Or at least pay attention as you're uploading it so that you know what each setting is and you gain a learning experience from there if you want to build a printer in the future, or if you just want to tweak stuff because you don't like how we have it set up. So we'll go ahead and go through that setup in a minute here. Again, my name is Shai. A little bit of a change of venue here so it's not so cold. American accent, and then we got Colin.
Yeah, English guy. Yeah, just to throw it out there, this printer, the ENIAC 40, I'd never really messed around with printer firmware before, so I was a complete firmware noob, but it made me quite nervous really when I was building it to the point where I was like, oh, I don't want to do this. Obviously, I had the help of Shay and stuff. But once I'd actually gone through the config, a lot of it is just common sense. And I learned so much now to the point where I'm quite happy just to create firmware for any printer that we make or design in the future. So it doesn't take long to sort of get your head around it.
Yeah, and for me, from my side of things, I mean, I've been in software development before, so I mean, I'm no stranger to code and development. But it was still daunting for me too. Just what is in the firmware? What's the settings? What does this do? What does that do? I totally agree. I mean, as you go through the UI, and for me, you just started looking at the code itself. It's a really, really well put together firmware with, I think, very clear. I mean, not knocking on Marlin or any other ones, but just for me, this was really easy to pick up.
Yeah, and the configurator just makes it a breeze.
Yep. So what we'll do for today, we're actually going to go through. I'm going to be sharing the configuration UI screen. Hopefully, you guys get a good screen at now, and I'll scroll through it as Colin talks through some of the individual settings here. I'll chime in when there's something to add, and then towards the end, we'll actually walk through the Arduino version of it and what it looks like, kind of at a high level and brief. And we'll talk about some of the dual zoom in and some of the tweaking that you have to do to the one of the actual files themselves to get that to work. So with that started, I'll just start the discussion with when you actually open up your Repetier configuration settings, right? You're going to repetier.com firmware, and then the default just goes to the version 9092. Of course, you can go back older one version. I don't know why 929 works just fine. We've actually built the top of the development version for things like the filament pause and the dual zoom in, as well as some other changes that just in talking to the Repetier development, I think it's just a guy, if not maybe a few guys, but they're actively developing this one and addressing any bugs and changes. And even though it's development, it is still very stable. So we've built the top of the development version. But for the most part, aside from the pause and dual zoom in, you could use 9.2 if you wanted to.
Yeah, and I'd probably advise you start with that, get your printer going, get it printing, and then that's when you want to delve into the development if you want to for all the bells and whistles.
Yep. Just remember that we do have in the configuration the pause and dual zoom in, so that may not work if you take that back to the development version. You might have to go back and change those settings.
It does. It does, I believe.
It does? Okay. All right.
Yeah.
I have not. I've got the development, never looked back. So, I mean, I've been printing fine on the development. I think Colin, you've been too.
Yeah.
We haven't had any issues. All right. So, basically what happens, you click here to switch to development. Once you do that, you're then presented with this page, telling you to go back if you want to. And then you go ahead and upload your configuration.h. We might actually provide this as a configuration.json, which I'll talk on again towards the end, which makes it easier for you guys to see the settings in the file and be able to upload them into the UI without getting bogged down with all the firmware related stuff. So if you did want to copy settings from a file and go through the UI yourself, I think the JSON file is an easier way to do it. I'll touch on that towards the end.
Are you going to load up your config, Shay, or are you just going to leave it as a generic?
No, it's loaded.
Okay, cool.
Yep.
Okay, so configuration level, you want expert because some of the stuff you're going to need to change basically is from a new built for the purpose of a new built printer. So you want to be able to get into all the nooks and crannies.
Configuration level.
Sorry, go on.
Okay, that threw me. Okay, so processor, it's a Mega. You don't really have to change that, and the ramps as well, quite simple. I'll try and go through some of the quick stuff reasonably quick and talk a bit more about the stuff you need to worry about. So printer type, that's a biggie. Now there's two options in there. You can see the one currently set is Z-axis, X and Y, H gantry, Core XY, which is key. That's what this machine is. It's a Core XY, which basically means your X and your Y stay on one level and your Z moves. Now, there's two options in there that read the same pretty much if you just answer them, but they are different. Now, it depends on what you set your left motor to do and what you set your right motor to do. If you set your right motor as X, it's one of the settings. If you set your right motor as Y, it's the other setting, but you'd pick one, try it out. And to be fair, I think the one we have here, X minus Y, if you notice at the end, equals X minus Y, is when the left motor is the X plane, if I remember rightly.
Yeah, correct. So this setting is the one that we recommend just because it makes it easier from a logical perspective when you're looking at the different parts. I've found it easier just in tweaking, kind of adjusting settings here and there, that it's easiest to make the left motor the X and the right motor is the Y, and then this is the setting that you pick in the firmware.
And that's as you look at the front of the printer.
Yep, exactly. And the key part in there, hopefully you guys see it on my screen there, it is the X minus Y, not the second one, which is Y minus X.
Yes, exactly. So pretty much simple. So that basically sets your printer type. You got EEPROM usage. Now we set this to one of the settings. I don't believe it particularly matters which one you set, but it allows you then to actually change settings via the LCD, which is really handy for when you're figuring out E steps to start with, and then you can go back and plug them back into your firmware if you so desire. Yep. So pick an EEPROM set. I think it's 0, isn't it, with no EEPROM set?
Yeah, so I'll cover this, I think, a little more. When you actually look at the code itself, I think this is a little clearer as to the different options that you can set. But you do have an option of doing EEPROM set 1 and EEPROM set 2 in this UI itself, right? So when you actually go into the configuration.h file, you can actually set a value between 0 and 255. And when we go through the settings, I'll talk about that a little more, but that really allows you to save your EEPROM and then choose whether you want it to be overridden or not.
Yeah. So basically, if you increment the number or change the number from a previous set, it basically overwrites your EEPROM on board, so it allows you to reset everything, because it's hard to know what's EEPROM and what's actually in firmware if you don't do that.
Correct. Yep. So we'll go through that a little more in detail here, but we'll go on to the primary port baud rate stuff.
Okay, so this sort of stuff you don't really want to touch. It's primary port, default port, baud rate. I'm not too sure what that's about, but I've just left it as is. I don't know if you know too much about that, Shay.
Yeah, so there's an argument here. I mean, I've been kind of in this stuff for a long time now. So there's an argument to be made about native speeds of the 18 mega chip and should you be running at 2500 or not. I haven't seen a huge compelling reason to be running at different speeds. I probably need to do a little more research and understand this a little better, but for the most part, I know most 3D printer defaults are either 1150-200 or 2500. Just make sure whatever one you choose here of the two, that you choose the same thing in your host software as well. And I wouldn't go choosing anything below 1152 because that's obviously slower. Anything faster than over 250 I don't think works. And anything between is just an odd number from a bit and byte size. So you want to stick to 1152, which again works for us just fine. Or if you understand it better than us and can help enlighten us, then you can choose 2500 too. All right.
Cool. So there's a few things I'll just skip over briefly because you don't really need to touch them. Like kill method is reset controller. Now I believe that's if one of the options, for instance, if it reads from your thermocouples and doesn't get a read back, that it kills it rather than then continues to do what it's intended to do. Is that right, Shay?
The keep alive interval here?
Sorry.
No, the keep alive interval is.
No, I meant the kill method.
Oh, yes, sorry. Yes.
Yeah, okay, cool.
So it's the kill method either if something goes wrong or if you actually hit the reset switch on the LCD, I think.
Yes.
The reset button on the Mega board itself will actually reset the Mega as a whole.
Yeah.
So this is and it's also, I think this is also if the you get a kill from the host software too.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, startup G code, never used that. I'm assuming you can use that in some way to offset the hot end or whatever pre-G code you would like to use, whether that's a clean of a nozzle or whatever, but I've not really touched it, to be fair.
Yeah, just remember this startup G code, it runs as soon as the machine turns on. So, if you did want to do something like, turn the machine on, wipe the nozzle, preheat the stuff, right? Remember to use your wait commands in the startup G code, and I think this is separated with semicolons. But yeah, just keep that in mind. This does start only as soon as the printer turns on. This is not a. I do not
like a slicer startup G code, is it?
Yeah, I mean, as far as I remember, that's the way I remember it. That it's a startup only when the machine starts up. So
yeah, okay. So dimensions, pretty simple. You've just gone too fast, Shay.
Oh, sorry.
Right. So dimension a bit further back. Okay, so they're just your minimum positions. Obviously, you want your minimum position to be 0, unless you have any offset. And then, as you can see from Shay's printer, he gets a X width of 395, a Y of 425, and a Z of 365.
Yeah,
now yours may be slightly different depending on what build you've got going on. Mine personally is 390, 390, 390. I'm still using the old X carriage, which is why I've got a bit more Z. And to be fair, Shay's got more Y for the simple reason is he made his build plate bigger, which is exactly what I would have done if I hadn't pre-ordered it before we realized we could actually print on a bigger space. So
yeah, and the 365 I think is a safe marker for now. There's probably another 5 or 10 millimeters you can squeeze out of that, but I'm just playing it safe for now and keeping it at 365.
You don't want your bed smashing into the deck, that's for sure.
Oh yeah, I had that before.
Okay, so Zed Correction. I have no idea what this relates to. I haven't changed any settings whatsoever here.
Yeah, so I mean, right now it just stores the Zed Correction in the EEPROM, but that doesn't matter because it's actually disabled entirely. This is only if you're using, if you want to use auto bed leveling, and this is actually more specifically what they call the auto bed mesh leveling correction in Marlin. So if you took the samples of the different points on the bed and then you want to correct that bed for the distortion of the bed, then that's when you would turn this on. My experience, it does not work that well on a Cartesian or Core XY square type of printer. I think it's mostly designed for deltas. I did try this, but in the sort of auto bed correction area, this is where I struggled because I couldn't get this distortion properly. Now, you may be able to within time, but I couldn't. And just a note too, because I made this comment in the past, the way that the correction works, actually both in Repetier and Marlin, is, should you decide to turn it on, is that it's only correcting from 0 until this degradation point, right? So at 0.5, it'll actually start to stop correcting for that degraded correction. I won't go too much detail here. And then it'll return back to 0 correction at 1 millimeter. So this is the 2 settings you'd want to play at, those 2 things, and a couple of other settings too. These probing values, right? So there's a whole bunch of stuff here. But important thing that I made a mistake early on thinking is that correction, auto bed level correction, is not for the whole entire print. It's only for those initial first couple of millimeters. So just to share that with you guys.
I didn't know that. That's news to me as well, that.
Yep.
Okay, learn something every day. Okay, so steppers. So a lot of these settings really we don't really have to touch. Disable steppers after so long. Disable as much as possible after inactivity. Delay, stepper at high signal. Again, I'm not too sure about any of these settings. I don't believe you have to mess with them at all. You've got delay, frequency where steps get grouped in double steps. You've got delay between double quad steps. You've got move cache size, assume ticks per move computation time.
I'll make a quick note on the move cache size. If you guys ever look on your LCD, particularly those coming from Wanhao, I think it says 20 something, and on ours it says 16, right? This is how much of the movement data gets stored in the Arduino Mega's cache itself, right? So there's an argument to be made that if you don't store enough, your printer will pause. If you store too much, you can actually start missing steps because you overload the cache within the Arduino Mega. So from what I've read and understood, somewhere between 16 and 24 is a good value. I think you can go up to the high as 32. I would not suggest it leaving at 16, only because with I think Colin doing about 100 millimeters per second in printing and me doing about 120, I think neither of us have seen any missteps, nor any slowdowns either.
If anything, the 16 works fine. The only time I think the 16 is an issue for me personally is if I need to stop the print for any sort of an emergency whatsoever. Obviously, there's a buffer time, so it carries on going for a few seconds. But to be fair, you need that buffer size, so it's not worth making it any smaller.
Yep. All right.
So we get down to, right, okay, we're getting to a couple of important ones. So we've got jerk XY moves. Now, my first printer comes standard with this setting set to 20, which is far too high. You usually start your setting at about 8 and then you tweak it. Now the jerk obviously is how quick it changes direction. So it does have a big effect on the print, I find this. So this is something you definitely want to get right. I can't remember what it automatically sets it to, but start at 8, see how your prints turn out.
Yeah, it does default to 20, and I agree. I mean, 8, even though I have the steel belts on, and I think I could probably go much faster on the jerk and acceleration settings. I'm just leaving this as is for now.
Yeah, same as me. Mine's at 8. I get fantastic prints, so I could probably push the boundaries at some point, but I'm happy with the speed it still gives me at that. Z jerk is exactly the same, but with your Z level moving. 0.3 is about right. There was a bit of a mess up in the dev firmware at some point. It set it to 3 for a few days before they changed it, and that was interesting. It would move very quick. I think that's what caused my initial wobble. But anyway, without getting off track. So yeah, so they're good settings to start with. X stepper motor. So obviously you're going to leave it as an X motor socket. Resolution, right? Okay, so you want to set this to 160 for the simple reason it's a Core XY and it takes twice the steps to produce the maneuver because both X and Y motors are working together. I think that's right.
Yeah.
Now your max. Oh, we've just lost it, Shay.
Yeah, sorry. And I noticed a comment from Bill here that the settings went a bit blurry, so
okay, cool.
I'm trying to see if I can share it a bit different way.
Okay.
I know, Colin, can you see that okay for you?
It was perfect for me the first time, but yeah, that's even clearer now. So
okay, good.
Okay, so yeah, we were getting on the resolution, X steps per millimeter. So 160, they're usually set to 80 on a regular Cartesian printer, but we double them up because it's a Core XY. Max travel speed. Now, this printer is capable of big speeds. I have mine set to 200, same as Shay. You can be a bit more reserved if you want, but there's no need. If anything, I'm sure we could probably go a bit quicker. So that's a pretty simple setting. Home speed, again, is how quick your X-plane homes to its micro switch. Your Z-min sorry, your X-min or your X-max, depending on how you've done it. Travel acceleration, again, sometimes these are set quite high, but I think the 1000 is a standard setting when you first start the firmware, so you want to leave them the same. Some printers go like 3000, but that's just too much. It's ridiculous. So you want to be 1000. For a Core XY, it's more than capable of handling that acceleration. Same with the print acceleration. Now, as you keep going, you've got invert direction. Shay's got on his X motor, and I believe that's because. Hold on, let me get this right. That's because your plugs went a certain way into your motherboard. Yeah. You don't actually have to invert it if you can turn your connectors around. And all that is that his X-plane was homing in the wrong direction. So if you go to home your X plane and it's veering off to the side where you haven't got your X minimum end stop, then you want to quickly switch your printer off, go back into your firmware and invert the direction, and then it will home in the right direction.
Yeah, and just for clarity too here, this is the settings I have at the moment. I do suggest that you resolve any sort of inverting or wrong movement if you can, just by the actual cables
Yeah,
or the
you
way
can
that
just reverse them, can't you? Turn them around.
Yeah, so that, I mean, that to me that's better, right? Correct the put it to the proper orientation first,
Yeah,
and then if you can't get it to work there, or if you just don't want to do it, then yeah, you can invert it here.
yeah.
It's the way I have it set up right now. When I post pictures, you'll see that. But I think that's an important part to remember with any printer build is, as you're going through it, just pay attention to that home movement. And we'll probably do a separate one-on-one video on kind of first steps to do when you finish your build. But that's important to pay attention to, right? If you're inverting that, if you're inverting in firmware and then your cable's on backwards, right? It's like a double negative. So
Yeah.
just
And
pay
it
attention.
doesn't necessarily mean you've wired it up wrong, because I've followed numerous wiring diagrams and they all said to put the cables and the colors in that way. But I think it's to do with the manufacturing of the stepper motors.
Yep.
They don't always wire them the same. You would think all the blue, green, red, and black wires would be the same way around on every stepper, but they're not. So it's not necessarily that you put your connector in the wrong way. It's just the way it's been wired from the factory. So just flipping it round would solve that problem.
Yep.
Okay, so the Y stepper, exactly the same as the X, because it's a core XY. The X and Y work together to give you movement. So the settings want to be exactly the same. Now the invert direction obviously would want to be the same as well if you've inverted previously. But other than that, nothing changes from the X. They should all be exactly the same. So Zed, if you just scroll down.
Yep. Get in there. Yeah. So just pausing for a moment so everybody can see the settings here.
Cool.
All right. Okay.
Okay, Z motor. So resolution here, 400 steps per millimeter. I can't remember why that was. Why did we set that so high?
Which one? Sorry.
The resolution, the steps per millimeter.
Is it different from the?
Oh, I know why. Sorry, my bad. It's to do with the lead screw that we used. Yeah. So it's 400 because it's worked out to 400 using, there's a calculation that you use from the pitch and I think the angle of your lead screw. If you're using a standard 2mm pitch, 8mm thick lead screw, then it's just a standard 400 steps. So I won't really go into it, but the calculation is out there if you decide to use different lead screws. But unless you know what you're doing, just stick with a standard. Max travel speed 12. For me, that's a little bit quick. I have mine set to 6, but all that is how quick your Z level is going to move when you're tweaking it or homing your Z bed or in your prints. Homing speed, Shay's got his set to 6, which is where I've got my max travel speed set to as well. That's obviously just how quick the bed moves. Now, this is a big ass printer. There is a long way for it to go. If you leave it at 4 or 2, it's a misery waiting for that bed to level down. Obviously, it doesn't affect the print because the print will just move however many millimeters layer height you're using. But when you're first getting that bed level and all the rest, you want it set quite high so you're not waiting around for hours.
Yeah, and I've had this set up as high as 12 and even 20, and it moves fine. The only problem is when you have that high homing speed, then you can get inaccuracies when it homes, right? It might overshoot just a quarter of a millimeter or half a millimeter. So I do like the slower homing speed, but it's still much better than on my Wanhao, which I think the default for the Wanhao is actually 1 or 2 for the homing speed, which is not bad because it's a small printer. But in this case, I totally agree. You do want a 6. I think that's a good happy medium. Yeah, you could certainly play with that. If we ever did go with thicker lead screws, I would definitely potentially try a higher speed. But 6 is, I think, more than fine for now.
Okay, cool.
And just a quick comment, Bill. I know you're on, and it might get a little difficult switching back and forth here between the two. While Colin's talking, I'm going to see if there's a way I can just keep the settings up since I'm doing the screen share while he talks over the settings. So if I can get that to work, I'll go ahead and do that. But otherwise, the way that it does it is Google Hangouts automatically focuses to the person that's talking. So I know that sucks a bit, Bill. I'm sorry. I'll try to see if I can fix that while Colin's talking here.
Okay, good stuff. So getting to some important stuff now. So the travel acceleration 100, print acceleration is 100. We have lower acceleration on the Z level for the simple reason it's not needed, and you're only moving really small movements, not like your Z, not like sorry your X or your Y. So you want to leave that as is. I think its standard is 100. Now, okay, so there's a few settings here. You've got invert direction of your Z motor, enable signal. You don't have to have any of that stuff ticked. Now, the key one here is on the ramps board, if you're using ramps, there's two connectors for two Z motors, which would mean both your Z steppers running off an individual driver. Now, while that is possible, it's not a route myself or Shay have taken. So as you can see there, one of the ticks we've got is mirror motor signals to other stepper. And what that does is it allocates another stepper motor connector for that second Z stepper. So it means that both Z steppers have their own individual drivers. Now, there's nothing wrong with having two motors on one stepper driver. It's fully achievable, but for my purposes, just for ease, I've mirrored it to, I think, the hot end 2 connector, and then I have my second Z motor plugged in there, and that's the reason why we've got mirror motor signals. Okay, if you're plugging both your steppers into a ramps board where there's two connectors, you may just decide to leave it, but obviously, without getting into too many details, you definitely want to make sure that your VREFs are right for two motors. Okay, nothing really on there. Just ignore that multiple Z end stop. Shay's going to talk about that at some point. I don't know if he wants to talk about that now or.
Yeah, well, so I'll make a comment. I mean, so I'll just the multi Z end stops. I had the 2 101 videos on it. It certainly does work. You can enable it here, but I do want to talk about a caveat, and I'll actually bring that up as we get more into the code if we have still a little time. Otherwise, I'll do a separate video specifically on this, because there is at least as far as I know, there's still a bug in the multi-Z end stops. The way that we have it set up, of course, it works fine in the Delta, but it doesn't work on ours. So there's a hack that actually was provided by the Repetier developer. So I'll cover that in a little bit. I don't want to muddy the waters right now, but yeah, I'll cover that towards the end.
Okay, cool. So we've got modify acceleration with increase in Z position. Don't interpolate. I don't know too much about that, but it's just a setting that we have. And then this is the important bit, mirror stepper socket. Before we've ticked mirror motor signals above. So this is where we choose the stepper socket. Obviously, you want to choose a socket that accepts a stepper motor and that has a driver space. And obviously, a no-brainer is Extruder 1 on your ramps board, or I think I used MKS. So on mine, I think it was Extruder 1 as well. Yeah, it was. So it just allows you to have two motors under separate drivers, and it just made life easier, really. You can always get breakout boards to have further hot ends in time to come. Yep. So end stops. Okay, so you always have your end stops in a negative direction because you'd always want to go to mins. So that would mean that the carriage would home. Let me get this right. As you look at the printer, your X would home to the left. Your Y would home coming towards you, and your Z would home lifting up to the top position, which is what you want on a Core XY. You can change that if you want. You would have to change a few other settings as well further down, but as a standard, you'd leave them the same. And as long as it homed in the right direction towards your min stops on your machine, and everything is fine. Home in order, I've tried changing these and it makes no difference whatsoever. I think I filed a bug report. I would like X, Y, and Z like Shay's got, but it doesn't work for me. X and Y always homes first and then Z last. Yeah, so that doesn't particularly work, but it's not a big deal which order it homes in. You've got min stops, switch to ground normally open. So that's basically your switch is open until touched, and then when it touches, it sends a signal and stops the steppers. Pretty self-explanatory. Z Max not installed. Obviously, we usually just on printers have one end stop. You could have two, but
So let me cover the couple of things on the switch to ground normally open. So if you follow the pictures that we've posted and follow the wiring on the micro switch, then this setting will be default. Basically means that your connection is open on the micro switch, but when it's pushed in or when it's triggered, that's when it closes that circuit to ground. There's an important thing to remember that if you actually do wire them backwards, you could wire the switch closed, which would mean that it's always to ground, and then that's when you would choose the second setting. So if you come into a situation where you've done all your wiring for the end stops and you try to home and it says it's already homed, and it looks like it's not moving on the X, even though it should, and you can always go in here, change the settings to normally closed, and see if that relieves it. Or again, just push it with your finger, and it's almost like the end stop's behaving backwards. When you remove your finger, that's when the end stop actually triggers. In that case, your wiring goes backwards. You can either rewire it to fix it, which I would do because I'm anal like that, or come back in here and change this to normally closed. And again, this Z2 min max, in the context of using a max end stop, no, we don't use it today, but this is for actually the for the dual Z min, so I'll talk about that later.
Cool. Okay, so maxes we don't tend to use. Right, so these settings here, go back after first hit, is just your end stops, how they react. And so I don't know if people notice on printers, it'll hit an end stop, it'll back off, and then hit an end stop again, and then find its final position on the Z. That's what basically those settings are for, but you shouldn't have to touch them. The standard settings that it's in there work perfectly fine.
Yeah, and just a note too, I did play around with these settings just so you guys know what they are too, that if you change the go back at first hit, what it does is it's that's once it hits the end stop, it goes to 5 on the X and then comes back and hits it again. So it's like the second test, right? And then so it'll go back to 5, and then for the second test it'll bring it to 3, and then do the test again. So that's how these two are related to each other, if that makes sense. And then this after homing, you want these settings to be enough so that it relieves the trigger for X and Y, right? So you want to be able to move X and Y after you've done the homing. That's why you want this at 1. For Z, I've always had this left at 0. Just to me, it makes sense that on the Z plane, once the bed is at that Z, you're right at that stop. I've actually changed this in the past before to I think like 2, and then what will happen is the print will actually start at 2. So you can probably correct that with some G-code offsets in your slicer, but I think it's just best to leave this at 110.
Agreed. Okay, pause handling.
So this is the pause via the UI though. So this is not the like jam or. Yeah. This is actually, if you were to pause via the UI itself, you can make this retract, right? I just had it set at 2 because we really haven't played on this. Theoretically, if you were to pause it from the UI, maybe you'd want to retract of more than 2. I don't know, maybe it's just 7 because you want to move it out of the HUD entirely. Then maybe you want to do something else when you pause. Maybe move it to the origin so it's not on the middle of the printer of the print itself. And then after you've ended the pause, maybe you want to do something after that. So again, you can probably get really crafty with the pause commands here. This could definitely be beneficial, and you could probably tie this to some other stuff. But this is not related to the jamming, which is what we'll talk about next.
Yeah. Okay, so jam detection out of filament. Now, why you just want bulk standard firmware before you get into filament pause and everything, which is part of the dev version, you still have a jam method in the standard firmware. Now, you can set the jam method to anything you like, as long as in your jam action, you basically tell it not to do anything. So, for instance, could you open up that setting, Shay?
No, I can't. When I show it on the screen, it doesn't actually show the drop-down menu.
Oh, right, okay.
So I'll just read them quick. So there's the first option on there is do nothing, just send a message, which is what Colin's talking about. That's what you want.
Yeah.
And the second one is the one that you guys are seeing, showing jam in and out. And then the third one is request pause to host server. So I'll cover those two in a second, but I'll let Colin finish his thought here.
Yeah, so basically I've got mine, or I did have my original firmware set to do nothing, just I can't remember the wording, but just do nothing basically. So even if the criteria met for a jam, nothing would happen because it's not just as simple as saying, okay, when jam gets high, do something, because you need to adjust various other settings for it. I've not bothered with jam settings. I know Shay will have, or has, or is going to. All I've got is pause detection, which is something really you want to get into after you've got the original firmware up and running.
Yeah, so just for clarity too, the jam detection is actually there you use there's different ways to do it, but basically what you're watching is how much filament is coming is being pulled from the spool, comparing that to the filament that's supposed to be extruding from the G code. And Repetier can deal with that configuration and basically wisely tell you if you have a jam, and then actually slow down the print dynamically to help try to account for that jam or that under extruder potentially. So it's a really cool and powerful feature, which I think works, but from my understanding is fairly complex and a pain to set up. Not just the hardware for it, but the actual settings here in the firmware and tweaking, get it right. So again, we suggest if you are sticking to the original version, just turn it off and ignore it. And then if you actually are going to use the dev version, which is what we suggest, is just set this to either the signal gets high or signal gets low. Again, that depends on how you have the micro switch actually set up.
Yeah, because it's not just a firmware setting. There is hardware that you'd need to install.
Yeah, so we'll probably do a more in-depth detailed video on exactly how the pause switch is set up. Colin has his working fine, but I know on mine I have some issues, I think just related to Repetier host. So I might need to change some of my settings here. But I'll tweak that as we go along, and then hopefully we'll do a video with it for you guys within about a few weeks or so.
Cool.
Next steps then, and I think for everybody too, I think we're showing the settings with Colin talking in the background. So hopefully that addresses... Yeah, I mean, I from what I've looked at the video, the settings are always up. It doesn't switch to you.
Oh, excellent.
So
okay, cool.
I can change that later, but just so you guys can see, hopefully this is helpful for you guys.
Yeah, makes more sense. Right, okay. So, available tools here. So basically, if you're not building a 3D printer, you would set it to something else. Default printer mode, fused filament fabrication. I'm not quite sure what that's about, but it's something I haven't changed, so I assume all's hunky-dory, so no need to change that. Fused filament fabrication, we then go on to temperature control range. Now, I'm actually going to let Shay probably take over a bit here, because I don't tend to bother with the PID range and stuff like that. I think he knows a lot more about that than me.
Yeah, so these settings themselves, I left at default, aside from the temp hysteresis. You know, it's freezing cold outside, and if I wanted to risk pneumonia, I would probably try to set this up a little better, just because the temperatures vary so widely where I'm at today. But if you're in a normal room, you know, I don't know, inside where it's not freezing and below 2 constantly like it is here, then this should be fine at 0. But you can change this and start playing for it a little more if you have some oddball temperature settings, you know,
environment.
Environment temperature settings, not printer related. The next stuff around temperature control range, this is all the PID related stuff. This is really the range that you want the PID manager to do the PID testing with, right? So if it goes outside that range, it'll drive the controller at full power, and then I think within 20 plus minus, it'll drive a variable value to the extruder, right? So that you get hopefully a stable temperature rather than just on off, right? At full power, that wouldn't be really good for your printer settings. You want to try to stabilize that. So I've left it at the default because I think it works well. The PID tuning that you do later on is really the key, and the PID tuning on the ENIAC is no different than the PID tuning on any other printer. The only sort of caveat that I'll add here, because you are in control of your own firmware, I do highly suggest that after you've run the PID process, you take those values that are then stored in the Eeprom and actually save them to your firmware, and then make sure that you, in subsequent firmware uploads, in the next upload at least, change your Eeprom mode, which I'll talk about later.
Yeah, definitely a wise thing to do. Any sort of settings, including e-steps or whatever, you definitely want to then go and feed that information back into your firmware. Even if you don't necessarily upload it back to your machine, but otherwise you won't know if you're coming or going.
Correct, yeah, and it's frustrating because it's like your EEPROM is setting one way, but your firmware is set a different way. So
Yeah.
it's handy to have the EEPROM because you can do tweaks without having to upload the firmware. But like we both said, just make sure you copy those settings to the firmware once you think that they're pretty good. So this, skip weight, all this stuff is again default. I think these are good settings.
Yeah.
Um,
There's
we don't,
plenty of tutorials out there on how to adjust your PID ranges.
yeah, and we'll put some links if we find some worthwhile ones that we think are really good. The extruder cooler temperature at, we don't use this one yet. Again, this is something in the future that you can actually set a dynamic so that your extruder fans, and these are the fans for the heatsink. So
Come on,
these are,
everybody gets that
yes, yes, you can actually set them to turn on at certain temperatures, which is pretty cool. But
Yeah.
you have to have
It
some
involves using a thermocouple as well, doesn't it? A new thermocouple, but it's totally achievable.
Yep, and then you have to do some things on the other hardware connecting the RAMs board too. So we'll leave that off for now. Uh, your max extruder temperature, right? Your min and max, right? These are kind of key, right? If you're below your min extruder temperature, you can't extrude. This 150 is actually probably a bad idea here. I was doing that for testing, right? So if you just want to see, hey, does my extruder motor even work with no filament through in there? 150 is a good value, but keep in mind if you try to extrude a PLA at 150,
It's going to go nowhere.
it's going to go nowhere, and you're going to get jam. You might grind your filament away. So I would suggest this is good for testing purposes, but as soon as you say, hey, I have the printer running pretty well, probably tweak this up to the 195, 210-ish range, whatever your average.
That's what I had mine set 200, and then not only that, when you're manually setting your temperature via your LCD to warm up or whatever, it's so easy just cycling from 200 up rather than all the way from 0 all the way up.
Yep. Yeah. So the other settings here around the maximum extruder temperature, right? 285 in my case because I have an all metal hot end. I think if you have a PTFE like Colin, what do you have yours set? 250 or 260?
260, I think.
Yeah, so just keep in mind that you can't, depending on your quality of your PTFE tube, that can start break down at 250. I know Colin hasn't had any issues. In my case, this is one area where we kind of have two different opinions: all metal versus PTFE all the way. But just keep that in mind. 285 is a safe area for all metal. 260 if you're using a PTFE.
And keep in mind, this is just like if your extruder reaches that temp in an emergency, something's gone wrong, it just turns it off basically. So it's not something that happens that often. It was just an emergency.
Yep, and then this min defect temperature, you want to make sure that that's at least set to lower than your ambient temperature by a decent amount.
I had a little bit of trouble with this setting. I tried changing that, and then I kept getting thermocouple decoupling.
Yeah.
Decoupling, yeah, a lot. So I've left that at -10. So just be wary. If you get that happening a lot, it's something to do with the firmware. I think it's an issue. So just leave it at -10 if you find it decoupling. But other than that, you should be fine.
Yep. So it's just, I agree, -10. So maximum defect temperature, right? This is really the setting where the firmware says, "Oh crap, something's gone wrong, and I need to shut off the heater."
Yep.
Basically like thermal runaway. So yeah, this is set to 295 in my case, right? I have it just 10 degrees above what the acceptable level should be. Just to
My
allow
temperatures are lower, guys. For the simple reason I only print PLA, so it's not like I need ABS temp or any other filaments at PETG or whatever. So yours might be different, probably more along the lines of Shay's temps than mine.
Yep, and just keep in mind too that if you do go too high, you do risk. I think really even if you're in an all metal hot end setup, you're really risking breaking two things. One is the heater cartridge, which if it's a cheap, crappy heater cartridge, might have a max temp of 300 and actually might start to physically break down if you go too high. And then your thermistor can also start to physically break down at temperatures of anywhere between 280 to 300. Mine, I have fair confidence that the M3 stud type that I use can handle that 295. So I'm okay with it for now. Although saying that I do have a broken thermistor that I have to go fix as soon as it gets a little warmer,
Hmm.
uh, which might be due to that too, right? So again, I would just suggest as you're starting this stuff out, keep these values fairly low, especially if you're doing PLA only, right? No reason to go above the 260s, and then just increase them as you feel more comfortable.
Yep.
So the preheating temp is really kind of, you're telling the firmware, hey, ignore the different thermistor settings, the other settings I have above for at least the first 30 seconds of the heating time. Might take longer to heat up, that the cartridge might take longer to heat up during the initial period. So that's why you want to keep that at 30,000 milliseconds, which is, I think it's actually 5 minutes. The math there. No, actually, no, that's, I'll do the math in a second, but 30,000 milliseconds, whatever that is in minutes. So the maximum extrusion length, yeah, again, we haven't gone too much into these in detail. We've left them out that they are. The decouple hold variance, same, leave it at 20. The decouple, leave this at 1. Same thing for PWM speed. And then the extruder X and Y speed, I haven't really messed with this one at all either. That's for
No,
dual.
I don't know too much about that.
Yeah, that's for dual. Right now we have the PID settings actually set to max, right? So if you've looked in the Eeprom settings or in the firmware, this is actually set to 255. That's where you just have it manually set to. You can check here, and that it will force it to that 255 value. But I'll show you guys further down we go where that actually is set separate. We don't use any of this advanced algorithm stuff yet. It's not stable, so we're leaving it as it is, not using the quadratic steps and stuff like that.
Okay, so the most important one there for me is enable heat bed. Obviously, if you're having a heat bed, you need to make sure you get that box ticked. So you bring up your heat bed settings, and obviously the firmware is aware that you've got a heat bed. PDM, I don't know, not quite sure what that's about.
Yeah, so this is instead of the PWM feature, again, I'm not sure either. My understanding is PWM is just a PDM. Is the way that it's turning the fans on and off and the heaters on and off.
Okay.
I would just leave it at that. Again, it's something that we probably need to research a little more. You have the kill, firmware on defect sensor. I think you should leave it off, because otherwise, if you have a defect, you won't know it, because the firmware will just reset on you and you'll be like, what's going on? So I don't suggest turning this on.
Okay, so then we get to the heat bed settings. Now, again, this is a bit personal, depending on what you plan on printing. My max bed temperature is 90 because I'm only printing PLA. I know I'm only going to have my bed at around 55 degrees. Shay wants to print ABS and all sorts of cool stuff, so he has his set to 120.
Yeah,
you definitely want something in there. I don't think you want to go too much above 120. Would I be right, Shay?
Yeah, and if you have the MK2 PCB style boards, don't go over 110. 110, you'll start frying the traces, I believe, and the stability of the copper will actually degrade. So just remember that, don't go above 110 if you have the PCB style. If you have the Kenevo or other kind of silicone style heat beds, again, this is depending on the manufacturer, so be very clear that you understand what they have it set to. But I know my heat bed, the way I bought it when I listed for you guys from Kenevo, can go up to 150. I'm not going to push it to 150. There's no need to, right? Even if I did polycarbonate, 120 is plenty for it. So I think set this again to a safe value, and if you know that you're not going to do anything but PLA, just set it to a low value, right? Don't let the heat bed go higher than it needs to.
Okay. Cool. Skip temp weight within 3 degrees. So basically, it's just if there's. Let me get this right. So if the temperature's within 3 degrees, it doesn't. Hold on, it does weigh or it doesn't weigh. I can't remember.
No. So if it's within 3 degrees, it doesn't do anything. So
That's right. Yeah,
so let's say
right.
if your bed is set to 70, it'll let it get to 73. At 73, it'll turn it off, and then at 67, it'll turn it back on.
Yes. Okay, temperature sensor. It's a basic thermocouple that you get on all printers, and that's the 100K thermistor. So that's your setting there. Pretty simple.
Let me go back real quick to the skip just I'm clear with everything. Skip temp wait, but so it's the way that it works is if you set your bed to 70, it'll bring it up to 70, then it'll turn it off. But remember, it's doing a temperature polling usually about every 5 seconds. So if it notices that it's at 70, but then it dropped to 67.5, or sorry, 69.5, 69, 68, 67.5, it's not going to do anything, right? When it gets to 67, then it'll actually turn on. And then it'll ramp it back up to 70, and then it'll stay off again until it does that, right? If you in a particularly warm room or you have it enclosed and it goes up to 71 or 72, again, it'll ignore it until 74, and then that's when it'll start the decoupling, or you know, sort of your, hey, what's going on here? Something, the heat bed is on a run. That's when those settings will start taking effect. So that, again, that 3 is a good safety net.
Yep, perfect. Temperature sensor pin and heat pin, they're just the standard ones you would use. Temperature manager, so this is quite an important one. I don't know whether the firmware still acts the same now as it did when I installed mine.
Yep, it does.
You set it to bang bang every X settings, so that basically turns the heat bed on, turns the bed off, turns the bed on, turns the bed off. Now that's pretty much the best way to go. I know there's other options, but for such a big build plate, to be fair, it works more than enough. But what I did find is when I set it in the firmware, I had to actually go and set it via the LCD. So when you've got this all rigged up in your firmware loaded up, go to your bed settings and just check that it says bang bang. Because although I'd set it in the firmware, when I actually went to the LCD, it was actually set to one of the other options. I can't remember what, and it pretty much fried my relay.
I think that's
turning too quickly.
Yeah, so I didn't want to cover that too. So I think that's actually been fixed. That was a bug.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah, because I know I've uploaded it and wiped the Eeprom, and I've checked and mine's been fine. And I've actually checked with a Yeah, and I know it works. So I mean, I'll verify again just to make sure. But I'm pretty sure that bug's been fixed. But I agree with Colin. No harm in just going to the Eeprom and checking to make sure.
Because if you're running on a relay system, it will kill your relay, and your relay will get very hot very quick and start a fire. So for a 2-second check, it's worth doing.
Yep, and just the key here too is this is bang bang every X seconds for heated bed with relay. There's the first option, which you guys can't see, but the first option is bang bang, simple switches on and off, that's the problem what Colin's talking about is what ended up happening is they'll actually try to PWM the heat bed and basically turn it on and off, I don't know, several 1,000 times a minute.
Yeah, a second. It's literally like, like you wouldn't believe.
Yeah,
but so just double check your settings.
Yep, so make sure that this is set that way. All right, and the decoupling test period, I actually did not see that for the nozzle. Hang on, let me just make sure because I did want to cover that for a second. So there's the... Oh, that's down here. Okay, so the decoupler for the heat bed, this is the only setting that's at 300 seconds, not milliseconds.
Yeah.
So again, that's saying within 5 minutes, the temperature has to go down or up one degree. I have experienced issues with this with a large bed, the cold temperature outside and only hitting one internal zone. But I think if you have it in an ambient room with normal temperature, I don't think this is an issue. But again, this is a safety check to make sure that your temperature is not going crazy and your heat bed is not running away. And again, that it's rising within an acceptable period of 1 degree per 5 minutes in this case.
Update interval. So I'm assuming that's just, I don't know actually what that's about.
That's how often the firmware itself will actually check the heater, right? So if you have your G code set to the heat bed at I don't know, let's say 80.
Because that's quite a long time. My firmware reacts quicker than that.
So I think you can override this by the host settings. So your host settings I think will do it faster, but from what I know, 8,000 milliseconds I think is only 8 seconds. My math is
80.
right. 80?
Is that right? Milliseconds? Milliseconds is 100, isn't it? So yes, 80. Is that right?
And I'll do the math.
You know what?
It's
early in the morning, but I've already done a day's work, so that's my.
It's 8 seconds.
8 seconds, okay.
Yep. So yeah. So it's 8 seconds. So that's how often it'll do that update, right? Again, you can tweak this and change it, but I think 8's fine. Again, you can override this with the host settings. So we'll jump into the extruder settings here and try to.
Okay, so extruder stepper, that's just a connector. What it's connected to, so it's extruder 0. You can invert motor direction if you wire it all up and it's pulling filament away from the printer rather than pushing it. You'll just invert the motor direction. Or again, like we spoke before, flip your connector in your board. Offset, nothing's needed for offset because obviously it's a feed rather than a movement of your carriage. Start speed 20 is a good place to start. Maximum speed 50. Resolution. So this is the important part. This is your steps per minute. So there's lots of videos out there about how you calibrate your steps per
step per millimeter.
Steps per millimeter. So the way you do this is you'd follow one of the videos. For me, I measure out 12 centimeters. Pull 10 centimeters through the extruder, measure what's left. If it's 2 centimeters, then the steps I have are currently fine. If not, there's a little bit of math you can do to work it out until when you pull so much filament that's the amount of filament that gets pulled. Shades is just short to 660. I'm on about 630. So it does vary a reasonable amount per printer because there's a lot going on. You might have PTF tube, you might not. Your particular Bowden tube might be a little bit easier given than the one I have, but you definitely need to calibrate before you do any prints because it'll make a big difference to your quality of them.
Yep, and I've found in general once I've set this, I can leave it at that, right? I'm possibly getting a slight under over extrusion.
Yeah.
I think 625 or 630 is a good place to start, and then just do your calibrations from there.
So that's all depending, obviously, on that you've wired if you're using ramps, that you've wired up the steps per. Am I right? No, the 1/16 steps on your. That's right, isn't it?
Well, yeah. So I mean, any of these resolution stuff that we're talking about are for the Allegros set to 1/16 stepping, I believe. With the default, you can set all the jumpers to on. On the ramps board or on the MKS.
MKS, no jumpers. It's automatically 1/16, so you don't have anything to worry about.
Yeah, so if you are going with, and also these are using the 1.8 degree steppers that we recommended before.
Yeah.
If you did buy 0.9 degree steppers, I think that this would be doubled.
Yeah, that's correct.
If you are using a different extruder, obviously this would be doubled entirely. And that's one of the reasons this is also so high. So those guys coming from the Wanhao, they're like, you're thinking, what the hell? The Wanhao is at 100, and this is at 650. You keep in mind it is the Wades and it's a geared extruder, so that's why the stepping is so high.
I went from an i3, which is probably just over 100, to like that, and I was like, this is crazy. This can't be right. But you'll do the tests, and it is.
Okay, so we'll cover the other stuff. We're getting close to top of the hour here, and we want to try to keep these close to an hour, and I do want to get to the coding stuff, so we'll try to jump through these a little quick, and there's not that much stuff left.
You lead.
So the temp manager is the PID controller, right? You don't want to use Bing Bang or other stuff, PID. This is what I talked about before, that you can force that max power for the heater, either through the setting above or just put 255 here. Decoupling, I have mine set to 24 seconds, which is for the hot end here again. I think this is a good value. The default, I believe, is set to 12 or 6, which in my case, again, because of my ambient temperature being colder, was too low. And I kept getting decoupling errors. So I found 24 to be a good value there. These PID settings here, you can use these to start off. But again, these came from my PID tuning, right? So we said before, do your PID tuning. Make sure you enter the values back into the firmware. That's why I have these here. We don't use extruder pin cooling, right? We talked before. We don't use this weight retract distance. And then the jam detection pin, again, when we cover that in more detail later. In this case, you pick which pin you're using. In my case, it's the X max end stop. It could be another one. And then you do want to enable the pull-up resistor.
Cool.
So go next step here. So features, there's a lot of stuff on here. I'll just kind of skip to the stuff that we're using.
Yeah.
Right. Most of these are all default. The watchdog, the arc, that's all default. Memory positions, leave that at default. Echo commands. Wait, SD card, right? If you have an SD card, leave it on. If you don't, obviously. This is also overwritten by the next UI page. We'll talk about in a second. Everything else is really the same. The baby stepping allows you to change the the Z height in the first couple of layers in case you need to smush it down a bit or add some little height to it. The fan controllers, obviously you want to leave that on. This G10 and G11, we just left it at that. If you're using a duet board or ESP, you label JSON. Power on startup, I just left it at that. And then, sorry, the print cooling fan will be the fan pin by default. Again, this maps to the board that you chose on the first page, so no reason to change that. All this other stuff is mostly all the defaults.
Yeah.
This goes into the board cooling fan, which is pretty cool that you can set that up too. We haven't done that yet, so that'll be coming in the future. The baby steps multiplier, SD card detect pin. I don't know, I guess they can use this to eject the pin or something, to eject the SD card. What you want to do if the SD print stops. And then this is the important part, disable the heaters and the motors on stopped SD print. So some host softwares will leave the heaters running, but will disable those steppers. In this case, if you're running off an SD and you stop it, this will actually stop the heaters and the motors. So again, just check or uncheck that based on your opinion. I think to leave that on is best. Bed coding in this case is all turned off because we are not using the probing sensors. If you are using some sort of a Z probe, then that's where you would change that. G10, G11 retractions, again, we don't use any of this stuff. Right now, all the retraction settings are all done by the G code and controlled by the slicer. I think this is going to be used in the future to allow the firmware to control G code settings or retraction. Sorry, I lost my mic here.
No problem.
So
all of them are pretty much standard settings.
Can you still hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Yep, so we'll leave those at that. Where'd I go here? So again, this goes into the, where's that? Yeah, so more of the retraction settings, extra drivers. We don't have any of those. Okay, so this is the LCD settings. Right? If you're going with the full-size LCD, like you've seen the pictures from Colin and myself,
I'd advise to go that way, to be fair. It's a great LCD. They're not much money at all, and they're just a good LCD.
Yep, and that's the full discount LCD. We've struggled with getting the smaller 2004 LCD to work with Repetier. You probably could get to work, but it seems like the different options here don't quite work as well. So we suggest just using the full one. I mean, obviously you have a huge printer, use a big LCD.
Yeah.
Add the languages here as you need them to be, right? If you need additional languages there. The encoder speed, again, this is personal settings. I like when the encoder moves a little slower, right? That means that as you turn the wheel left and right, it requires 1 or 2 more clicks to change the menu item, right? I find that if you put it on a normal or fast, it's too jumpy around for me, and I will often choose the wrong menu item. So I like the slowest setting, but again, you can change this based on your opinion. The beeper settings is the buzzer that's on the LCD screen. If you like having that beeper or not, I like it, enable it. If you don't like it, disable it. This page switching is by default, but that'll basically, once you're printing or it's gone idle, or it'll switch the pages automatically between the info page. I don't like it. I like it staying on the screen where I left it. I don't want it to change to back to the info page. So I've actually disabled that. You can change stuff like this, the speed encoder, right? So the faster you spin the wheel, the quicker the menu items change. Same one as this one here. You can reverse the encoding direction if you want it to go backwards. Again, the bed coding menu is disabled entirely. We have these set to 1,000, 3,000. In my case, it's the printer named ENIAC, and then the printer company, I just named it that. Again, this can be whatever you want. This headline is new, and I haven't played with this. This is actually only in the development version. So I've been meaning to change this, but this is, I guess you could kind of change the headline for the printer. Everything else here is really the default. I really wouldn't mess with any of this stuff. There's no need to. Just, when you get to the presets temperatures here, maybe you want your bed temperatures. This is all referring to the quick settings page. So if you want to change these quick setting temperatures, this is where you would change those.
Pretty simple and self-explanatory.
Yep. These should, if your max bed temperatures, these should all relate to your back to your firmware settings, right? So in this case, you can see I have my maximum heat bed is set to 120, but the UI will let it go to 130. It will not go to 130 because the firmware's default is 120. So you can't overwrite what you set before, but you might, try the UI setting it to 130 and you'll be confused why it's not going up to 130. So you don't want these values to exceed what's in your default values. And I wouldn't have them lower either. It doesn't make sense to me. Same thing for all the other stuff. You can change the feed rate from the extruder, when you actually extrude. Manually from the LCD screen and retraction settings, you can change those as well. I think leave them at 2 and 3 for now is fine. In my case, I do have the case light enabled, and I'll probably do a separate video on that with a relay as soon as I get all that stuff done. So for now, I would actually, if I upload mine, I would suggest just disabling the case lights. It doesn't do anything if they're on if you don't have it set up properly, but it's actually pretty cool that you can have the case light set up. We don't do any manual additions right now. This might be done in the future. And then finally, you get to the download settings, and when you're here, you can actually download all the complete firmware with all the files needed to get this to work. Right, this is good with the dev version every couple of weeks, just to make sure you're up on the latest files.
I would recommend, though, when I create firmware, I download all 3 files. I download the complete firmware, I download the configuration, and I download the config JSON, or however you want to call it. That way, I've got 3 fallbacks. If something was to go wrong or the files get corrupted or whatever, I've got 3 ways to get back to that same firmware.
Yeah, so that's a good point to make too, because these two are the settings files, and they're in different formats, and then this one's the settings plus the firmware, right? So just to show you guys what the JSON will look like, we talked about before, that you might want to go through individual settings through the code, and again, I'm going to brush through this pretty quickly. I don't know if we'll have time to go over the dual Z-min stuff. I'll try to be, if I can, I'll be there quick. If this loads here. So if you do export the JSON, right, and you're going to go through the menus, and this is the way that we'll upload the file as the JSON file. You can import a JSON file. You can also import the config.h file. So maybe we'll just put both. But what's nice about this is that it's very clear what each setting should be set at when you're going through the menu. Or sorry, when you're going through the UI, you can very clearly see what these values relate to. Sometimes they are a bit encrypted because they don't have the same value as what's actually set in the UI. And I'll go back to the configuration.h here. You can see that these don't have any spacing to them, right? So this might be the xmin POS, whereas in here it might be the xmin x_min position, or n stop x underscore. So the values are not the same. So that's one of the things I want to make sure you guys follow along here. If you do decide to edit some of these settings within the config.h file, it's fine, it'll work, right? And these variable names relate to the values that you see on the screen here when you're actually going through the configurator, right? So they relate to these settings down here. So if you want to see what the default printer mode is, right, you can go back into the configuration.h. And you can find that setting, right, and it'll be right there. So you can see, okay, this is set to 0 for fused filament fabrication, right, FFF. So that's just good for your knowledge and know-how, right? But the thing to be aware of, right, as you're changing different settings here, when you upload this configuration.h file back into the UI, the GUI version of the editor, it does not read these values up here. So you'll upload these values and you'll say, wait, my settings are not there. Well, what it's actually reading is the values down here. So this is that JSON format that I talked about before. And the UI will actually read this JSON, and it's this JSON that it will use to set the values within the configurator tool. So be kind of cautious about that, right? If you're changing a value in the top portion up here, right, your firmware will read that, and that's what you want. But then make sure you also try to find that setting down here for the JSON. Or at least before you upload it, go back to the configurator and make sure you upload manually in the configuration tool. That did cause me a lot of headaches when I was uploading my config.h file, and very confused as to why the settings from here were not actually implemented in the UI themselves. And you can see that down here. So the bed temperatures, right? It's kind of spread all over the place. So hopefully this will be cleaned up in the future. The last thing I'll touch on real quick is the Eeprom mode. So you can see how Eeprom mode is set to 2. Again, this is between 0 to 255. So you might increment this just for your own kind of version control as you're tweaking things around here if you're not using the GUI. So you might go 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Just can keep track. I've just now settled to going back and forth between 1 and 2 because I'm not changing that much stuff very often. And that's really the main part of it. Trying to think of anything else. The dual zoom in, I think I'll do a separate video on specifically on that, just because I don't want to glance over the code change to the motion PP file, which actually corrects some of the issues in the code, and I actually want to give the guy a couple more days to see if he actually fixes the issue. So it's actually a code change in this file, if I remember right, or the motion.h. I have to double check. But there is a change you have to do the code. So I'll leave that as it is for now. Again, we'll upload the file with the dual zoom in place there. I'll go ahead and share my motion.h and motion.cpp file for anybody that wants it. That's at that stage. If you want, you have your dual zoom in files, and we'll have a separate video on that specifically, firmware related, later on. All right. So with that, I'll stop the screen share. I think that was it. I tried my best to follow along with any questions that came in the chat. I'll check real quick if I missed something. Let's see. Nope. No questions in the chat. Thanks, guys.
Catch you all next time.
Yep. Thanks, guys, for joining. Hopefully this was helpful. Again, the config.json, the config.age, and all the other related files will be posted shortly. Give us a day or two just to clean stuff up and make sure that we're not missing something. And we'll get that uploaded to you guys. It'll be probably in the pinned post, just to make it easier to find.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys.
Take care. I'll talk to you guys soon.